welcome to Void of Rules. I was just looking at my channel analytics, and a shocking 85.5% of you watching right now aren't subscribed. If you're enjoying these stories, consider hitting that subscribe button to help me reach 1k subscribers by the end of the year. It costs absolutely nothing, takes just 1 second, and you can always change your mind later. Drop a like on the video too. It really helps with the algorithm. Now let's jump into today's story. The envelope arrived on a sweltering July afternoon. I remember staring at it for a long time, the crisp white paper stark against my cluttered kitchen table. Inside was a deed to a property I'd never seen, and a brief note explaining that my great-uncle Elijah, a man I'd met only once as a child, had passed away and left me his farm in rural Mississippi. "Congratulations," the lawyer's letter read. "You are now the owner of the Walker family farm, approximately 80 acres of fertile farmland, a farmhouse, and several outbuildings. At 32, with a stack of student loan, debt, and a recently ended engagement, the prospect of escaping the city for a fresh start was enticing. I'd grown up helping my grandfather with his modest vegetable garden, and the thought of open space and soil beneath my fingernails pulled at something deep inside me. 2 weeks later, I packed my belongings into my old Chevy pickup and headed south. The roads grew increasingly unfamiliar as I drove deeper into Mississippi. Highways gave way to state roads, which narrowed into county routes that wound through dense forests and occasional small towns. Each mile seemed to peel away another layer of the modern world, replacing it with something older and less defined. The GPS lost signal about 10 miles from my destination. I resorted to the printed directions provided by the lawyer, following winding country roads that became progressively narrower. When I finally turned onto a long dirt driveway, the property revealed itself gradually through a tunnel of ancient oak trees, their branches interlacing overhead like gnarled fingers clasping together. The driveway emerged from the tree cover, revealing a vista that stopped me in my tracks. The farmhouse stood alone in a sea of overgrown fields that stretched toward distant tree lines. 2 stories of weathered white clapboard with a wraparound porch and green shutters hanging askew. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across a landscape that seemed frozen in time, beautiful in its neglect, yet somehow foreboding. Behind the house sprawled acres of neglected land, some open fields, some forested, with a large pond gleaming in the distance like a mirror, reflecting the cloudless sky. The barn, painted a faded red, leaned slightly to one side as if tired after decades of standing watch. Smaller outbuildings, a chicken coop, a tool shed, what looked like a smokehouse, were scattered across the property in various states of disrepair. I parked and stepped out, the humid air wrapping around me like a warm blanket. For a moment, everything was still. No birdsong, no insects buzzing, just the weight of silence pressing against my eardrums. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, sound rushed back. Cicadas, distant frogs, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. A crow cawed somewhere overhead, the sound echoing across the open space. "Home sweet home," I murmured to myself, trying to ignore the strained feeling that had settled in my stomach. Not quite dread, not quite excitement, but something uncomfortably in between. The key the lawyer had sent slid easily into the lock. The door opened with a groan, revealing dimly lit rooms filled with furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts caught in suspended animation. The place smelled of dust and something else, something earthy and faintly metallic that reminded me of garden soil after rain. I spent that first day exploring the house, uncovering furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, finding photos of stern-faced ancestors staring back from tarnished frames. Some of the older portraits depicted men and women with my same hazel eyes standing proudly in front of crops that seemed impossibly abundant for their era. In one particularly striking image from what appeared to be the 1890s, A harvest display featured cornstalks that towered over the farmhands and pumpkins the size of wagon wheels. The kitchen had been modestly updated sometime in the early 2000s, with a refrigerator that hummed to life when I plugged it in, and a stove that looked serviceable enough. Cupboards held mismatched dishes coated in dust, and the pantry contained rows of ancient home-canned vegetables, their contents indistinguishable through cloudy glass. It was in the kitchen drawer, beneath a stack of faded dish towels, that I found the journal. Leather-bound and worn smooth with age, the cover bore only the words, "The Rules," in faded ink, the handwriting ornate and deliberate. I laughed when I opened it, expecting to find household guidelines or perhaps farming advice passed down through generations. Instead, I found a list written in different handwritings, as if added to over generations. 1. Never harvest crops after sunset. 2. Don't look directly at the pond on the full moon. 3. Always leave 3 pieces of fresh produce on the stone altar at the edge of the eastern field. 4. If you hear whistling from the cornfield, go inside immediately and lock all doors and windows. 5. The scarecrow in the western field must be replaced every spring with specific materials: ashwood frame, clothes soaked in well water and soil, stuffed with dried corn husks and graveyard dirt. 6. Never kill the blackbirds that land on your fence. They aren't birds. 7. If the well water turns cloudy, don't drink it for 3 days. 8. Don't enter the old barn during thunderstorms. 9. If you see lights in the forest beyond the property line, ignore them completely. 10. Always plant a ring of purple flowers around the house. The list continued for several more pages, each rule stranger than the last. Some had been crossed out, others amended, with notes in the margins. One particularly unsettling entry simply read, "If the shadows move against the sun, don't follow them." I closed the book, attributing it to the eccentricity of rural traditions, or perhaps my great-uncle's declining mental state in his final years. Still, something about the earnestness of the different handwritings gave me pause. Some entries dated back decades, perhaps even a century, judging by the fading ink and formal penmanship. That night, I slept on a sleeping bag on the living room floor, too exhausted to worry about cleaning any of the bedrooms. Through the uncovered windows, moonlight cast strange patterns across the wooden floorboards. I dreamt of roots growing through the floorboards, curling around my ankles as I slept. Not painful, but possessive, as if the house itself were ensuring I couldn't leave. I awoke at dawn to discover mud on my bare feet, though I had no memory of going outside. Brushing it off as sleepwalking, something I hadn't done since childhood, I set about making the place habitable. The following weeks passed in a blur of hard work. I cleaned the house room by room, airing out decades of mustiness and scrubbing away layers of dust. The structure itself was surprisingly sound, needing only minor repairs to fix leaky faucets and squeaky floorboards. In the attic, I found boxes of family documents, birth certificates, old letters and farming records that detailed extraordinary yields year after year. Outside, I cleared overgrown patches near the house, repaired what I could of the porch, and visited the local hardware store so often that the owner, a man named Frank, began preparing my orders before I reached the counter. "Walker Farm, huh?" he said one afternoon as he loaded bags of fertilizer into my truck. "Ain't seen nobody working that land proper in years." "My great-uncle left it to me," I explained. "Did you know him?" Frank paused, his weathered face creasing in thought. "Elijah kept to himself mostly. Came in for supplies now and then." He hesitated, his hand resting on a bag of seed potatoes. "Land out there's supposed to be real fertile, though. Almost unnaturally so, they say." Before I could ask what he meant, he changed the subject, talking about an upcoming county fair and offering tips about which local mechanics I could trust with my truck. It wouldn't be the last time I noticed locals redirect conversations about my property. The more I worked the land, the more I understood what Frank meant about its fertility. Seeds planted in the morning had sprouted by the following day. Plants grew vigorously, requiring constant pruning to keep them from becoming unwieldy. Even in areas that I hadn't yet cleared, volunteer tomatoes and squash emerged through the weeds, as if the soil couldn't help but produce. By the end of the first month, I had cleared enough land to plant a modest vegetable garden. The soil was indeed incredibly rich, black and loamy, almost too perfect. It clung to my hands in a way that felt almost affectionate, reluctant to be brushed away. When rainfall was scarce, my plants remained inexplicably hydrated, their leaves perky, while neighbouring wild vegetation wilted. I was tending these seedlings when I first met Jackson Reynolds. He appeared at the edge of my property on a rusted tractor, a tall, lean man with skin darkened by years under the Mississippi sun. A faded trucker hat, shaded eyes that evaluated my work with a professional scrutiny. "Thought I'd come meet the new neighbour," he called out, climbing down from his machine. "Been watching you clear this place up. You're putting in good work." We talked for nearly an hour. Jackson owned the farm adjacent to mine and had lived in the area his entire life. He offered advice about local growing conditions and shared stories about the community, which families had been there the longest, which store had the fairest prices, which church picnics had the best food. He asked casually about my plans for the farm, nodding approvingly at my modest ambitions to start with vegetables and perhaps add some chickens once I was established. It wasn't until he was leaving that he gestured towards the eastern edge of my property, his expression shifting subtly. "That old stone thing still there? The altar-looking thing?" I nodded, remembering the weathered stone structure I'd discovered while exploring. It resembled a crude table formed from a single slab of limestone, balanced on 3 smaller stones, the entire arrangement surrounded by a perfect circle of bare earth where nothing grew. "Yeah, I found it. Wasn't sure what it was." Jackson's expression tightened. "My granddaddy used to say the Walkers had some strange beliefs, said they'd leave offerings there." He shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his hat. "Listen, I know it sounds foolish, but folks around here, they respect traditions, even ones that seem peculiar." "What kind of offerings?" I asked, but Jackson was already climbing back onto his tractor. "Just old country ways," he called over the engine's rumble. "Nothing important, but if I were you..." He paused, seeming to reconsider his words. "Well, I'd just be mindful is all. This land's been in your family a long time. Might be reasons they did things the way they did." After he left, I found myself returning to the Journal of Rules. Rule number 3 stared back at me. Always leave 3 pieces of fresh produce on the stone altar at the edge of the eastern field. "Ridiculous," I muttered, closing the book. Yet that night, as darkness fell, and the sounds of the farm changed from daytime chatter to nocturnal murmurs, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. From my bedroom window, I could see the edge of the eastern field, a darker patch against the night sky. Several times I thought I saw movement there, something low to the ground, flowing rather than walking. 2 days later, I noticed the seedlings in the eastern section of my garden had withered overnight, despite being perfectly healthy the previous evening. The soil there had changed too, drier, almost sandy compared to the rich loam elsewhere. When I dug down with my hands, the earth felt hot, as if something beneath was generating heat. I told myself it was coincidence, perhaps poor drainage in that section, or some quirk of the land's composition. Still, that afternoon I found myself placing 3 tomatoes from the grocery store on the weathered stone altar. I felt foolish doing it, but also strangely relieved, as if I'd settled an outstanding debt. As I turned to leave, a breeze rushed past me, strong enough to ruffle my hair but somehow affecting nothing else. Not the grass, not the leaves on nearby trees. For just a moment, I could have sworn I smelled something sweet, like overripe fruit mixed with freshly turned soil. The next morning, the tomatoes were gone. I assumed animals had taken them, though there were no tracks or scattered remnants around the altar. But when I checked my garden, the withered plants had perked up, their stems once again green and vital. New buds had appeared overnight, promising flowers and eventually fruit. More disturbing was what I found at the altar: 3 perfectly round indentations in the soil, as if something had pushed up from beneath to consume what I'd left. When I tentatively touched one of these depressions, the soil felt warm and seemed to shift slightly beneath my finger, like something breathing far below. That evening, I read more of the journal, paying closer attention to the marginalia, notes added by various hands commenting on the consequences of following or ignoring each rule. 3 days of rain after failing to replace the scarecrow, one note read. Another, in shaky handwriting, whistling lasted all night when Robert forgot to lock the windows. Found claw marks inside the following morning. Some entries were more cryptic. "It watches from the pond," one simply stated. Another written in what looked like a child's hand. "The birds told me secrets when I fed them. Mama says I shouldn't listen." As spring gave way to summer, I established a routine. Each morning, I worked the land, marveling at how quickly everything grew. In the afternoons, I continued renovating the house, stripping away decades of neglect, and each evening, I dutifully left 3 pieces of produce at the altar. I began noticing other oddities. Tools I was certain I'd left in one location would appear in another. The water in the well sometimes carried a faint sweet scent that reminded me of overripe fruit. Birds avoided certain sections of the property entirely, creating pockets of unnatural silence. Once, while digging a new garden bed, my shovel struck something solid about 2 feet down. Expecting a rock, I was unsettled to uncover what appeared to be a segment of stone, carved with the same strange symbols I'd noticed on the altar. When I returned the next day to excavate it further, the soil showed no signs of having been disturbed, and I found nothing but earth where the stone had been. In early June, I finally ventured into the old barn, which I'd been using only for basic storage until then. The interior was cavernous, with stalls for animals long gone, and a hayloft that creaked ominously in the breeze. Towards the back I discovered a trapdoor in the floor, secured with an iron padlock so rusted, it crumbled in my hand. The door opened to reveal a root cellar, shelves lined with ancient glass jars, their contents unidentifiable with age. But it was the floor that drew my attention. Unlike the packed earth of the barn above, the cellar floor was smooth stone, engraved with concentric circles surrounding a central point. The pattern matched the bare circle of earth around the altar. I closed the trapdoor without further exploration, securing it with a new padlock from town. That night, I dreamt of the circles expanding outward, spreading beneath the entire farm like ripples in water. One evening in late June, I was returning from town when I noticed lights flickering between the trees at the northern boundary of my property. They moved in patterns too deliberate to be fireflies, weaving between trunks, pausing, then continuing deeper into the woods. Sometimes they would cluster together, forming larger, more complex patterns before dispersing again. Rule number 9 flashed in my mind. If you see lights in the forest beyond the property line, ignore them completely. But curiosity got the better of me. I parked my truck and grabbed a flashlight, telling myself I was simply being a responsible landowner, checking for trespassers. The sun had just set, painting the western sky in fading oranges and purples, while the eastern horizon already showed the deep blue of approaching night. The forest grew denser as I followed the lights, the ground beneath my feet transitioning from packed dirt to a spongy moss that seemed to cushion my steps unnaturally. The air grew thick, not with humidity but with something else, an expectancy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The lights disappeared as I approached, always remaining just out of reach. They moved with purpose, sometimes circling back as if to ensure that I was following. The deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. Trees I didn't recognize loomed overhead, their bark textured in patterns that somehow seemed meaningful, like a language I couldn't quite understand. Eventually I found myself in a small clearing I hadn't discovered in my previous explorations. At its center stood a circle of stones, each carved with symbols I couldn't recognize. They resembled no language I'd ever seen. Not quite letters, not quite pictographs, but something unsettlingly in between. Each stone was positioned precisely, the entire arrangement aligned with what I assumed were the cardinal directions. More disturbing was the absolute silence, no insects, no rustling leaves, despite the breeze I could feel on my skin. It was as if this patch of forest existed slightly out of sync with the rest of the world. Even my breathing seemed muted, the sound unable to travel properly through the air. I knelt to examine one of the stones and felt immediately dizzy, my vision swimming with flashes of images, roots spreading through soil, something pulsing beneath the earth, faces I didn't recognize contorted in expressions of rapture or agony. A whispered voice, neither male nor female, seemed to emanate from the stone itself. "The bargain holds!" I stumbled back to the farm, disoriented and nauseated. The familiar lights of the farmhouse guided me home, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the distance was somehow greater than it should have been, as if the property had expanded while I was away. That night I dreamt of the clearing, but in my dream the stones formed a mouth in the earth, endlessly hungry. From its depths came that same whisper: feed, nurture, maintain. I awoke to find mud tracked through the house. Not my own footprints, which would have been somewhat explainable given my dazed return, but smaller prints that started in the middle of the kitchen floor and proceeded through the house before disappearing at the back door. They resembled a child's barefoot tracks, except for the unusual spacing of the toes and the extra digit on each foot. When I checked, all doors and windows remained locked from the inside. After that night, I began following the rules meticulously. I planted the ring of purple flowers, coneflowers and asters, around the house as instructed by Rule 10. I avoided the pond during the full moon. I replaced the tattered scarecrow in the western field with one made to the specifications described in Rule 5, a frame of ashwood, clothes soaked in a mixture of soil and fresh water from the well, stuffed with dried corn husks and a small pouch of graveyard dirt, which I reluctantly collected from the small family cemetery at the edge of the property. The new scarecrow unsettled me. Unlike the traditional smiling-faced effigies, this one seemed watchful, its burlap head tilted slightly as if listening. Sometimes from the corner of my eye, I could swear it had shifted position, arms raised slightly or head turned towards wherever I was working. Yet whenever I looked directly at it, it appeared unchanged. More disturbing were the blackbirds mentioned in Rule 6. I first noticed them one morning. 7 identical crows perched on my fence posts, watching me with unblinking eyes. Unlike normal birds, they never seemed to eat or drink. They simply observed, occasionally tilting their heads as if evaluating my work. When I approached, they didn't fly away but turned their heads in perfect unison to follow my movements. "They aren't birds," the rule had stated cryptically. Looking at their 2 still forms and eerily intelligent eyes, I believed it. I began leaving scraps of bread near the fence posts each morning. The offering would always be gone when I returned, though I never saw the birds eat. On days I forgot, small dead animals, mice, moles, once a rabbit, would appear on my doorstep, arranged in patterns that reminded me of the symbols from the stone circle. Jackson visited occasionally, always keeping our conversations light, though I caught him glancing at the flourishing ring of flowers with approval. Once, when he spotted the new scarecrow, he nodded slowly. "Good to see you taking care of things proper," he said, his tone casual but his eyes serious. "Old ways are best ways on this land." When I mentioned the strange lights in the forest, he abruptly changed the subject, his normally relaxed demeanour becoming tense. "Some things better left alone," he said simply. But as he was leaving, he added, "Full moon's coming this weekend. Might want to stay inside. Draw the curtains." My crops thrived beyond all expectation. Tomatoes grew plump and vibrant, corn stalks towered overhead, and melons swelled to enormous sizes. The zucchini plants produced so prolifically that I couldn't harvest them fast enough, the vegetables reaching the size of baseball bats if left for even a day too long. Strawberries grew sweet and perfect, each one identical in shape and colour, as if manufactured rather than grown. I began selling at the local farmers market, where people remarked on the exceptional quality of my produce. Many asked about my secret, smiling as if expecting tales of special fertilizers or innovative growing techniques. "Walker Farms always had the sweetest corn," an elderly woman told me as she selected an armful. "My mother used to say it was because the land was blessed or cursed, depending on who you asked." She chuckled, but her eyes didn't share the humour. As she turned to leave, she added, "You look just like your great-grandfather, you know." Same eyes, he understood the land too. Others were less subtle in their curiosity. "That old place has stories," a middle-aged man commented while purchasing tomatoes. "My daddy used to talk about lights in those woods, said your family knew things other farmers didn't." Before I could respond, his wife tugged him away, whispering something that made him fall silent. The townsfolk's reactions ranged from cautious respect to thinly veiled suspicion. Some went out of their way to purchase from me, while others would walk past my stall without making eye contact. Children would stare openly, sometimes pointing, until their parents hustled them along. One particularly unsettling encounter came from a stooped old man who approached my stand not to buy, but to press something into my hand. A small cloth pouch filled with what smelled like dried herbs. "Protection," he whispered, his rheumy eyes earnest, "for when it gets hungry. They always get hungry eventually." Summer stretched into fall, and as my first harvest season approached, financial pressures mounted. Equipment repairs, property taxes, and unexpected expenses had drained my savings. When an agricultural equipment salesman mentioned offhandedly how unusual it was to see such productivity from that old Walker place, I realized I could leverage my farm's reputation. A restaurant owner from a nearby city offered to buy a substantial amount of my produce for a farm-to-table event, praising the exceptional flavor profile of my vegetables. I eagerly agreed, seeing an opportunity to establish a lucrative commercial relationship. The catch was that he needed the delivery the following evening, which meant harvesting late into the day. As the sun began its descent on the appointed day, I found myself still in the fields, racing against the fading light. The vegetables seemed to resist being picked, the stems unusually tough, requiring more force than usual to sever. Rule number 1 echoed in my mind: never harvest crops after sunset. "Just superstition," I muttered, pulling another ear of corn as the sun dipped below the horizon. Old farmers' tales. The change was subtle at first. The quality of silence shifted from the peaceful quiet of evening to something weighted and observant. The air grew thick, making each breath feel incomplete. And the soil beneath my feet seemed to soften, yielding in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if something below was rising to meet me. I continued working, refusing to acknowledge the unnatural darkness settling between the rows, or how the plants appeared to lean away from my touch. When I cut a head of lettuce, the severed stem leaked a fluid too dark and thick to be sap. The tomatoes I pulled from the vine were warm to the touch, their skin pulsing slightly against my palm. It wasn't until I heard movement from the western field that I finally paused. The scarecrow had turned its head. I was certain it faced east when I'd last passed it, but now its burlap face was directed toward me, the crude stitched mouth somehow different, wider, expectant. As I watched, frozen in disbelief, one straw-filled arm raised slightly, index finger extending in an unmistakable, beckoning gesture. That's when I heard it, a low whistling from the cornfield behind me. Not wind through the stalks, but a deliberate melody, almost playful in its rhythm. It reminded me of a child's tune, but distorted, the notes sliding into each other at impossible intervals. Rule 4. If you hear whistling from the cornfield, go inside immediately and lock all doors and windows. My harvest forgotten, I ran. The ground beneath my feet seemed to grip at my boots, the darkness between crop rows deepening unnaturally. Twice I stumbled, my hands sinking wrist deep into soil that felt warm and almost fluid. When I pulled free, I could have sworn I felt it trying to hold on. The whistling followed, never growing closer or farther away, maintaining a perfect distance, as if toying with me. It changed occasionally, mimicking bird calls, imitating snatches of songs I recognized, sometimes shifting into what sounded like words in a language I couldn't understand, but somehow recognized on some primal level. I burst from the fields and sprinted toward the house, not daring to look back. Inside, I slammed the door and frantically checked every lock, drawing curtains across all windows. The whistling continued outside, circling the house in a leisurely path. Once, I peeked through a crack in the curtains and saw nothing but darkness, a darkness deeper than the night should have been, as if the space around my home had been replaced with something ancient and vast. Hours passed. The whistling continued, occasionally interrupted by scratching at the doors and windows. Not the random sound of branches in the wind, but deliberate, almost thoughtful in its rhythm. Sometimes it would pause, as if whatever was outside was listening for my response. In those moments of silence, I could hear a subtle shifting from beneath the house, like something large moving through the earth below the foundation. Near midnight, a new sound emerged, a soft, almost childlike voice calling my name from just outside the kitchen window. "We're hungry," it said, its tone conversational. "You've denied us our due," the covenant phrase. The whistling finally faded. As dawn approached, I emerged from the house to find my fields transformed. The vegetables I'd left unharvested had changed. Corn ears now displayed kernels, arranged in those same unrecognizable symbols. Tomatoes had darkened to a deep purple, their skin stretched tight over shapes that didn't quite match their usual form. In the soil itself, I found peculiar indentations, as if something had emerged and then returned beneath the surface. I didn't sleep. Instead, I pored over the journal, reading each rule carefully, noting details I'd overlooked before. Small annotations in the margins painted a disturbing picture. This wasn't just a list of superstitions, but a carefully maintained pact with something that lived in or beneath the farm. "The offering refused brings hunger," one note read. "The circle broken brings visitation." Another, in faded pencil, "Grandfather says we feed it so it doesn't feed on us." Most alarming was an entry dated 1937. "It grows stronger. The old bindings weaken, reinforce the circle in the northern woods, but the stones bleed now when carved. Elijah says we must adapt the covenant for modern times, but the old ways are safest." The next morning I drove to the county library. The elderly librarian eyed me curiously as I requested historical records about the Walker farm. "Research for the property I inherited," I explained, trying to sound casual despite my sleepless night. "The Walker place." Her eyebrows rose. "That's quite a legacy you've stepped into." She led me to a section of county archives, pulling out dusty folders and bound volumes of local newspapers. "Your family goes back to the founding of this county," she explained. "Jeremiah Walker was one of the original settlers, quite the successful farmer by all accounts." The records revealed fragments of a disturbing history. The land had been settled in the 1830s by Jeremiah Walker, my ancestor who had arrived during a devastating drought. While surrounding farms failed, the Walker land produced abundant crops within the first year, a miracle attributed to Jeremiah's farming skills and the naturally fertile soil. But newspaper clippings from later decades told another story. Unexplained disappearances of farm workers, rumours of strange rituals, a visiting agricultural expert who wrote about the inexplicable growing conditions before abandoning his study suddenly. County records contain complaints from neighbouring farms about unusual animal behaviour near the Walker property, livestock becoming agitated, refusing to go near certain boundaries. Reports of strange lights were dismissed by authorities as swamp gas or overactive imaginations, though the land contained no swamps. Most telling was a journal entry from 1923, written by Thomas Walker, describing a bargain made by Jeremiah with something ancient that slumbered beneath the virgin soil of the territory. The bargain ensured prosperity in exchange for certain observances, the first iteration of the rules I'd found. "The land hungers," Thomas had written. "It must be fed properly and respectfully, or it will feed itself. The covenant binds both ways, fertility for observance, punishment for neglect." A church record from 1896 described the Walker family's gradual estrangement from the local congregation. The pastor's notes mentioned concerning pagan practices and unholy abundance in their harvests. After 1910, the Walkers no longer appeared in church records at all. The most recent documents detailed my great-uncle Elijah's declining mental health in his final years and the farm's gradual abandonment. His doctor's notes mentioned paranoid delusions about something watching from between the crop rows and voices from the pond. A police report described a wellness check where officers found Elijah living in squalor, surrounded by arrangements of vegetables in ritualistic patterns. Most disturbing was the last entry in his medical file. Patient claims the land is angry and the hunger grows, refuses to leave property despite deteriorating conditions, claims his presence keeps it sleeping. I sat in the library until closing time, piecing together a history both extraordinary and terrifying. The Walker farm had always produced exceptional crops, but at what appeared to be a terrible price. Each generation had maintained the covenant, following the rules and performing the rituals that kept whatever lived in the land satiated and partially bound. And now that responsibility had fallen to me. I returned to the farm with a newfound determination to respect every rule. I meticulously performed each ritual, left the offerings, avoided the pond during full moons, and never stayed in the fields past sunset. For a while, it seemed to work. The strange occurrences diminished, and even the atmosphere of the farm felt lighter. The birds seemed pleased by my compliance, occasionally leaving small, shiny objects on my doorstep. Old coins, unusual stones. Once, a pocket watch that still ticked, though its face showed symbols instead of numbers. The scarecrow remained in its proper position, no longer shifting when I looked away. Even my dreams became more peaceful, though they still featured the land prominently, roots connecting everything on the property, pulsing with a shared heartbeat that matched my own. But I couldn't escape financial reality. When the first frost threatened, I faced losing half my late-season crops if I didn't harvest quickly. With a large loan payment looming, I made a fateful decision. I would work through the night to save my harvest. Rule number 1, be damned. I prepared thoroughly. Floodlights powered by generators illuminated the fields. I hired 3 workers from town, ignoring their nervous glances as darkness fell. None of them knew about the rules, and I convinced myself that perhaps they only applied to the walker who owned the land. "We need to get everything harvested tonight," I explained. "I'll pay double the usual rate." The men, Patrick, Derek, and Miguel, nodded agreement, though they kept looking at the boundary of light where the illuminated fields met the darkness beyond. Miguel crossed himself before beginning work. Derek kept glancing at the scarecrow visible in the distance, its shadow elongated by the artificial lighting. We worked efficiently as night descended, the powerful lights holding the darkness at bay. For the first hour, nothing unusual occurred beyond a steadily dropping temperature that didn't align with the weather forecast. The crops remained normal, lacking the disturbing transformations I'd witnessed before. Maybe it's the lights, I thought. Perhaps whatever affects the land can't operate in artificial daylight. It was Patrick, the youngest worker, who first noticed something wrong with the soil. "It's moving," he said, kneeling to look closer at the ground between the rows. I dismissed his concerns, urging everyone to continue working. But soon, all of us could see it, the soil rippling subtly, like the surface of water disturbed by something moving beneath. The plants began to tremble, not from wind but from their roots being pulled downward. Miguel dropped his basket, muttering rapid prayers in Spanish. "This isn't right," he said. "Something's under there." "It's just the ground settling," I insisted, though I knew better. "Probably some animal tunneling." But then, Derek shouted, pointing toward the forest edge where the stone circle lay hidden among the trees. Lights had appeared there. Not the dancing illuminations I'd followed before, but a steady glow that pulsed in rhythm with the movement of the soil. "We should call it a night," I suggested, trying to keep panic from my voice. But as we turned toward the house, the lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness broken only by the distant glow of stars. In that moment, I felt it, the farm awakening around us. The soil shifting beneath our feet, the plants rustling despite the still air, and something else, a presence rising through the land like groundwater seeping upward. "Run," I whispered, and then louder, "Run!" We scattered. I heard the others' shouts fade as they fled towards their vehicles. Miguel was screaming something about demons as he sprinted towards the driveway. Derek stumbled and fell, disappearing into a row of corn as the stalks bent inward, enveloping him in a rustling embrace. His screams cut off abruptly. Patrick made it the furthest, reaching his truck before the ground beneath it simply opened. The vehicle tilted and slid into darkness, leaving nothing but disturbed soil that smoothed itself over within seconds. I ran towards the house, but a section of ground before me heaved upward, blocking my path. The soil bulged and split, revealing nothing but deeper darkness underneath. A sweet, rotting smell wafted from the opening, like compost and honey and something older than either. I veered toward the barn instead, remembering too late rule number 8. Don't enter the old barn during thunderstorms. Though the sky was clear, the air suddenly carried the metallic scent of lightning. Static electricity made my hair stand on end as I wrenched open the barn door and stumbled inside. Behind me, I heard a low rumble, not from the sky but from the earth itself, as if something massive was shifting position far below. The interior was different. Though I'd been in this barn dozens of times storing equipment, it now seemed cavernously large, the walls stretching away into impossible darkness. The dirt floor had been replaced by smooth stone engraved with familiar symbols, the same as those on the stones in the forest clearing. The air felt thick, almost liquid in my lungs, and carried whispers at the edge of comprehension. Dimly, I registered the objects from the barn. My tractor, tools, bags of seed, were still present but altered. The tractor's metal had taken on an organic quality, its surfaces rippling slightly. Tools had merged with the wooden posts they hung on, the materials blending together as if they'd grown that way. At the centre stood a figure that both was and wasn't there, a distortion in the air that suggested a form, without fully revealing it. It shifted as I watched, sometimes appearing humanoid, sometimes suggesting something with too many limbs, too many angles. Its edges blurred into the surrounding air, making it impossible to determine where the entity ended and the world began. "You broke the covenant," it said, though I heard no sound. The words simply appeared in my mind, accompanied by sensations of roots pushing through soil and stone grinding against stone. The voice carried echoes of many others, men, women, children, all speaking together with the same ancient consciousness behind them. "I didn't understand," I gasped, backing away, until I hit a wall that felt oddly warm and yielding against my spine. "The rules of the prison and the key," it continued. "Each broken rule loosens what was bound. Each followed rule maintains the chains. This has been the way since your ancestor first cut into our sleep with his plough." Understanding crashed over me. The strange rules weren't superstitions. They were constraints, a cage built of ritual and observance that kept something ancient contained. Something that had made a deal with my ancestor Jeremiah for fertile land, in exchange for its partial freedom, a bargain maintained through generations of walkers, now my responsibility. "What are you?" I whispered. Images flooded my mind. A being old as the earth itself, slumbering until human settlement disturbed its rest, hunger and curiosity drawing it toward the surface, the bargain that allowed it limited interaction with the world above. I saw Jeremiah Walker kneeling in drought-parched fields, slicing his palm and letting blood drip into the cracked soil, whispering promises to something he sensed but couldn't see. I saw generations of my family maintaining the covenant, some with reverence, others with fear, all understanding the consequences of negligence. The entity showed me its nature, not quite deity, not quite demon, but something that existed before such distinctions. It had been part of the land since the continent formed, growing slowly in power and awareness over millennia. Human settlement had both awakened and constrained it, the focused attention of belief and fear, giving it new forms of expression while binding it to certain limitations. "The others fled," it noted, tendrils of awareness extending toward the driveway where Miguel had escaped. "But not you. The land is yours. The covenant is yours." I realized with horror that the entity was right. I couldn't abandon the farm, not just because of financial ties, but because doing so would abandon the responsibility passed down through my bloodline. If I left, whatever remained of the binding would deteriorate, and what was partially contained would be free. "What about my workers?" I asked, dreading the answer. A sound like distant laughter rippled through the barn. "They are part of the land now. The nutrients they provide will feed many seasons of growth." An image flickered in my mind. Bodies dissolving into soil, consciousness absorbed into a greater whole, not gone but transformed into something unrecognizable. "I'll follow the rules," I promised. "Every one of them. Just don't hurt anyone else." The present seemed to consider this. The old covenant wanes. A new binding must be made, blood to soil, intention to word. Tendrils of darkness extended from the figure, reaching toward me. The hunger grows with each generation. The original terms no longer satisfy. What followed was a negotiation unlike any I could have imagined. The entity demanded observances and I set limitations. By dawn, we had established new terms. I would maintain the traditional rules with modifications, and in exchange the fertility of the land would continue while the entity remained mostly bound. I sealed the agreement by adding my own handwriting to the journal, blood mixed with ink, as I wrote the additional rule. The owner of the Walker farm must spend one night each month in the stone circle in the northern woods, listening to what speaks from below. Knowledge given must be knowledge kept. As the first light of dawn filtered through the barn windows I was certain hadn't existed hours before, the entity receded. "We are bound anew," it whispered as it faded, "until the next breaking." I stumbled from the barn into morning light that seemed too bright, too normal after what I'd experienced. The farm appeared unchanged, crops standing in neat rows, soil undisturbed. No sign remained of the night's events except for fresh tire tracks leading down the driveway, Miguel's escape, and the complete absence of Patrick's truck. In town later that day, I heard Miguel had fled the county entirely, babbling about moving earth and hungry darkness. People dismissed his tales as the delusions of a drunk or drug addict. No one reported Patrick or Derek missing, and when I cautiously inquired about them at the diner, I received blank stares, as if the men had never existed. Jackson visited that afternoon, his expression knowing as he surveyed my exhausted state and the protective circle of purple flowers I was reinforcing around the house. "Rough night?" he asked mildly, though his eyes held understanding beyond the casual question. "You could say that," I replied, unsure how much to reveal. "My grandfather used to help your great-uncle sometimes," Jackson said after a long pause. "With certain maintenance issues on the property, said his family and yours had an understanding going back generations. He handed me a small cloth bag similar to what the old man at the market had given me. Herbs to burn at the new moon. Helps keep the balance." "You know," I said, it wasn't a question, as Jackson nodded. "Not everything. Enough." He looked out over the fields, his gaze lingering on areas where the soil had been disturbed. "Every piece of land has its quirks. Yours just has more history than most." "History," I repeated. "That's one way to put it." "The way I see it," Jackson continued, "our forefathers made certain arrangements to survive in this place. Not our place to judge, just to honor the commitments." He met my eyes directly. "But I will say, your uncle, toward the end, he let things slide. Got too proud, thought he could bend the rules. Land remembers, though." Before leaving, he added casually, "Town council meeting this Thursday. Might be good for you to come, meet some folks properly. Being part of the community matters around here." The following months passed in an uneasy new normal. My crops flourished beyond any natural expectation, allowing me to repay debts and begin renovations on the farm. I followed every rule meticulously, including my monthly vigil in the stone circle, where I listened to ancient secrets and knowledge that no human was meant to possess. Those nights in the circle were transformative. As I sat among the stones, the entity would rise partially into our world, sharing knowledge that alternately fascinated and horrified me. I learned of civilizations that had risen and fallen on this continent long before recorded history. I was shown how plants communicated through networks of fungi, passing information across vast distances. Most disturbing were the glimpses of other entities like the one bound to my land. Ancient consciousnesses slumbering or partially awake in various places around the world, each with their own pacts and bargains with the humans who lived above them. "We are the old growth," it explained once. "Before your kind stood upright, we spread roots through this world. We sleep, we wake, we transform. Some of your kind call us gods. Some call us devils. We simply are." My appearance began to change subtly. My hair grew faster. My fingernails developed faint ridges that resembled the patterns on the stones. Sometimes when I worked in the soil with my bare hands, I could feel the entire farm as an extension of myself. Every plant, every creature, all connected in a web of awareness centered on whatever dwelled below. Jackson noticed the change in me, the newfound confidence paired with a perpetual wariness, the way plants seemed to lean toward me as I passed, the unusually vivid green of my eyes that had once been a duller hazel. "You've settled in," he observed one afternoon as we repaired a section of fence together. "Most new owners don't last a season." "The land and I have an understanding," I replied, which wasn't untrue. "Good to hear," he nodded. "This place needs someone who respects it." I attended the town council meetings as Jackson had suggested, discovering that many of the older families knew something of the Walker farm's nature. No one spoke of it directly, but I noticed the deference with which I was treated, the way conversations would pause when certain topics arose, the meaningful glances exchanged when my exceptional harvests were mentioned. The mayor, a woman in her 60s named Eleanor Blackwood, invited me to join a historical preservation committee that I soon realized was actually a group dedicated to maintaining various boundaries and arrangements with entities similar to mine. The entities varied in power and awareness, she explained, but all had been bound through agreements established by the town's founders. "Your family's situation is unique," she told me during a private conversation in her office. "Most of these arrangements involve communal responsibility. The Walker Covenant is personal, direct, more dangerous in some ways, more powerful in others." Word spread about the Walker Farm's revival. Prospective buyers for my produce emerged from across the state, drawn by rumours of exceptional quality. Local restaurants featured my vegetables prominently on their menus, advertising them as heritage produce from historic Walker Farm. I hired permanent help, careful to ensure they never stayed past sunset and followed the rules without understanding their purpose. A year after my arrival, a real estate developer visited, offering an outrageous sum for the property. He arrived in an expensive SUV, his tailored suit out of place among the farm buildings. As I showed him around, his eyes gleamed with the calculations of potential profit. "This location is perfect for our new development," he explained, gesturing expansively. "Luxury homes with farm views, a golf course over there, maybe a boutique hotel where the old barn stands. We could really transform this area." I showed him around, pointing out the thriving crops, the renovated farmhouse, the picturesque pond. He was especially taken with the eastern field, kneeling to examine the soil. "This soil is incredible," he remarked, crumbling some between his fingers. "I've never seen anything like it. Our landscape architects could do wonders with this kind of foundation." As he spoke, I noticed the soil shifting slightly beneath his hand, forming almost imperceptible patterns before settling back into place. A faint humming seemed to emanate from the ground, though the developer gave no indication of hearing it. "It's what makes the Walker Farm special," I agreed, watching as the ground subtly shifted beneath his feet, though he didn't notice. "It's not for sale, though." "Everything has a price," he insisted, naming a figure that made my eyes widen. "Think about it. You could start fresh anywhere you wanted." For just a moment I was tempted, not by the money, but by the possibility of escape, of passing this burden to someone else. Then I remembered the entity's words. "The covenant is yours." I understood now what that truly meant. The binding wasn't just to the land, but to me personally, my bloodline, my awareness. If I sold the property, the rules would be broken, the entity freed from its partial containment. What would emerge would no longer be bound by any human agreement. As he was leaving, I handed him a small basket of produce. "A parting gift," I explained, making sure to include 3 pieces for him to leave at the stone altar on his way out. I had instructed him on the importance of the local tradition of leaving an offering, watching carefully to ensure he complied. That night, thunder rolled across a clear sky as I sat on the porch, watching lightning flicker between the stars. a reminder from the entity that while our covenant held, its patience had limits. The weeks that followed brought more prosperity and more strangeness. The birds multiplied, 20 or more sometimes lining my fence, their unblinking gaze following my every move. The pond developed patches that reflected scenes from other times, glimpses of the farm as it had been in previous centuries, or perhaps as it would be in futures yet to come. Once I saw my own reflection with features that weren't quite mine, older, wilder, eyes glowing faintly in the twilight. In late autumn, I discovered I could speak to the plants, not with words, but with intention, guiding their growth in ways that defied conventional agriculture. With a gesture, I could accelerate ripening or slow decay. The locals noticed but said nothing, simply accepting my gift as part of the Walker legacy. Winter brought relative peace. The entity slumbered deeper when frost covered the ground, though I still maintained the monthly ritual in the stone circle, now dusted with snow. During these quieter vigils, I sometimes caught glimpses of previous walkers who had sat where I now sat, ghostly figures performing the same observances through decades and centuries. That winter, I added a postscript to the journal and sealed it in an envelope along with a letter explaining everything I had learned. Not that I intended to leave, the farm and I were bound together now, but someone would need to know if anything happened to me, if the responsibility ever passed to another walker. The final rule written in my now steady hand: if you hear someone knocking on your bedroom door at night, don't answer. It's not me. I live alone, and I never enter the house after dark. As spring returned, bringing with it another cycle of planting and growth, I realized I had changed in ways beyond the physical. My dreams were no longer my own, but shared with the entity, our consciousness blending during the hours of darkness. I found myself knowing things I shouldn't, where to dig to find artifacts from civilizations long vanished, which wild plants held healing properties unknown to modern medicine, how to whisper to the blackbirds in a language that made them bow their heads in response. I began keeping a second journal, recording the knowledge gained during my nights in the stone circle. Some of it seemed valuable: cures for plant diseases, methods of natural pest control, ways to enrich soil without chemicals. Other information was darker: how to bind spirits to objects, words that could cause pain when spoken with the right intention, glimpses of worlds that existed alongside our own but followed different physical laws. Jackson became something of a confidant, though I never revealed the full extent of what I'd learned. He shared stories passed down in his family about the Walker farm, filling in gaps in my understanding. My great-grandfather used to tell about a drought in 1887. He recounted one evening as we sat on my porch. Every farm for miles was failing except yours. People got suspicious, then scared. A group came out here with torches one night, planning to burn the place down, claiming it was unholy. What happened? I asked. None of them made it past the property line. Ground opened up and took them, he said. Jackson sipped his coffee. Could be just stories, but 7 men did go missing that summer. Town records show that. In early summer, a university researcher contacted me, interested in studying my farm's exceptional productivity. Dr. Elaine Morgan, an agricultural scientist, arrived with equipment and enthusiasm, talking about soil composition and microbial communities. Your farm defies explanation, she said, examining samples under a portable microscope. The diversity of beneficial organisms here is off the charts, and there are several species I can't even identify. I allowed her study, curious what science would make of what I now understood was beyond scientific explanation. After 3 days of increasingly bewildered analysis, she discovered the stone circle in the woods. I found her there at sunset, standing frozen between the stones, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at something only she could see. When I touched her shoulder, she startled violently. "This place," she whispered. "It's speaking." "You should go," I told her gently, guiding her back toward the house. Some things aren't meant to be studied. She left the next morning, her enthusiasm replaced by quiet contemplation. A week later, she sent a letter formally discontinuing her research, citing personal reasons. The final paragraph read simply, "Whatever you have there, it isn't just a farm. Be careful." That summer brought more visitors curious about the increasingly famous Walker produce. I welcomed them during daylight hours, shared my organic methods, and always ensured they left before sunset. Several tried to sneak samples of soil or plant specimens for analysis. The samples invariably decomposed into unidentifiable mush before they could be tested, or so I heard from Jackson, who kept tabs on such attempts. One visitor, an elderly indigenous man who introduced himself only as Joseph, lingered after a tour of the fields. As the others returned to their bus, he approached me privately. "My people knew of this place," he said quietly, "long before the settlers came. We stayed away from this ground." "Why?" I asked, though I suspected the answer. "The earth here is thin," he replied, making a gesture I didn't recognize. "The boundary weak. What sleeps below should remain undisturbed." He studied my face, seeming to find something there that satisfied him. "But I see you understand this already. You have made your peace with the caretaker." "The caretaker?" "That is what my ancestors called it. Every place has a spirit, but this one is older, more aware. It keeps things from crossing that should not cross." As he turned to leave, he pressed something into my hand. A small stone amulet carved with symbols that matched those in the stone circle. "For the difficult nights," he said, "when it grows restless and the dreams become too much." Fall came again, bringing harvest and the anniversary of my arrival. The farm had transformed completely from the neglected property I'd inherited. The house gleamed with fresh paint, fields produced in abundance, and I'd even added beehives in a small orchard that already produced fruit despite the sapling's young age. I'd transformed too. My connection to the land had deepened beyond anything I could have imagined. I could sense visitors approaching long before they reached the driveway. Plants responded to my touch, sometimes growing visibly when I encouraged them. The black birds brought me objects they found, coins, buttons, once a diamond ring that I locked away, unable to bring myself to touch it after seeing the vision it triggered of its previous owner. Most significantly, I no longer feared the entity below. We had developed a relationship of mutual respect. Not friendship exactly, but something like symbiosis. I maintained the boundaries that kept it partially contained, and it shared knowledge and ensured the farm's prosperity. Sometimes, after my vigils in the stone circle, I would walk the property in darkness without fear, aware of its presence flowing beneath me, like an underground river, powerful but channeled. A young couple approached me at the farmer's market that autumn, introducing themselves as prospective buyers of a neighbouring property. As we chatted about the area, I felt a familiar prickling sensation. The woman was with child, though she had not announced it. The entity stirred in my awareness, interested in new life, coming to its territory. "You should visit sometime," I offered, "see what farming in this region is really like." They arrived the following weekend, the woman, Maya, admiring my flowers, while her husband Daniel asked practical questions about water access and winters. I showed them around, noting how the soil shifted subtly near Maya's feet, responding to the dual heartbeat she carried. The black birds gathered on the fence posts, their attention unusually focused on the visitors. As they prepared to leave, I gave them a basket of produce, explaining the local tradition of leaving 3 pieces at the stone altar near the edge of the property. Daniel laughed, but complied, seeing it as charming local colour. The entity stirred as they placed the offering, its attention lingering on Maya's abdomen. That night, during my dreams, it spoke more directly than usual. New bloodlines approach. Potential. I understood the implication. The entity viewed the young couple, especially their unborn child, as possible additions to its influence. The child born within its territory might develop connections similar to mine, another awareness it could touch, another mind it could shape. The couple purchased the neighbouring farm the following week, and I found myself in the unexpected role of mentor, helping them establish their new home. I was careful to instruct them in certain traditions, rituals disguised as practical advice that would keep them safe without revealing the true nature of the area. Always plant purple flowers around the foundation, I explained to Maya as we worked in their garden. Good for pollinators, and they repel certain pests. I didn't mention that the flowers created a boundary that the entity's influence couldn't easily cross, protecting their home from dreams and visitations. Don't harvest after sunset, I told Daniel, as we repaired their fencing. The temperature drop affects vegetable quality. A simplified explanation that would keep him safe from what emerged in darkness. Their child was born the following spring, a girl they named Lily, with eyes that sometimes reflected light in unusual ways. From her earliest days, plants leaned toward her crib, and the black birds often perched outside her window. I provided a mobile made of specific woods and herbs to hang above her bed, claiming it was a traditional gift. In reality, it was a subtle protection, limiting the entity's access to her developing mind. During my monthly vigils, the entity frequently inquired about the child. Not with words, but with impressions and images that conveyed its interest. I understood its hunger for new connections, new awareness to influence, but I also recognized my responsibility to protect the family that had unknowingly settled within its reach. This became my additional mission, maintaining the balance between the entity's containment and its need for interaction, while ensuring it didn't extend its influence too far. I became not just the caretaker of the Walker farm, but a guardian of boundaries for the entire area. 2 years after my arrival, a real estate developer returned. Not the same one who had tried to purchase my land, but a colleague from the same company. He spoke of the area's potential, the increasing interest from city dwellers seeking rural escapes. This whole region could be transformed, he enthused. Your farm would be the centerpiece. We could build around it, preserve its historic character, while developing the surrounding land. As he spoke, I felt the entity's attention sharpen, its consciousness rising closer to the surface than it had in months. The soil beneath us darkened with moisture that hadn't been there moments before, and a wind stirred the crops despite the still air elsewhere. This land isn't suitable for development, I said firmly. Drainage issues, unstable soil composition. Any construction would be problematic. He persisted, talking of engineering solutions and modern building techniques. As his words continued, I noticed the black birds gathering, dozens of them lining every fence post and tree branch, their unnatural stillness finally catching his attention mid-sentence. "What's with the birds?" he asked, unease creeping into his voice. "They're very protective of this place," I replied. "As am I." That night, I spent hours in the stone circle, negotiating with the entity. Its anger at the threat of development was palpable, manifesting as tremors in the ground, an atmospheric pressure that made my ears pop painfully. The covenant protects both ways, I reminded it. You cannot simply eliminate perceived threats without consequences. We reached a compromise. I would take more active measures to prevent development in the area, and it would refrain from direct action against those who proposed such changes. The agreement cost me another ritual added to my monthly obligations, another small piece of my humanity exchanged for continued peace. The following week, I began attending county planning meetings, using my growing influence as a successful local farmer to oppose zoning changes that would allow commercial development. I formed alliances with conservation groups, donated land to create a wildlife corridor that would complicate building permits, and even purchased additional acreage as buffer zones around my property. Maya and Daniel became allies in these efforts, though they understood only part of my motivation. "It's about preserving our way of life," I explained when Daniel questioned my intensity. "Once this kind of land is lost, it can never be truly recovered." Their daughter Lily, now a toddler, grew increasingly attuned to the farm's peculiarities. She spoke to the blackbirds in made-up languages that made them bob their heads in response. Plants sprouted from seeds in her tiny garden days faster than they should have. Once, during a visit to my property, I found her standing at the edge of the pond, conversing with her reflection, except her lips weren't moving while the reflections were. I intervened, gently leading her away while explaining the rules about the pond. Later, I reinforced the protective charms around their home and gave them additional traditional practices to follow, all designed to limit the entity's access to the child's developing awareness. By my 3rd year on the farm, I had achieved a delicate equilibrium. The entity remained mostly contained, satisfied with our evolved covenant and the limited expansion of its influence. The Walker farm produced bountifully, its reputation for exceptional quality spreading beyond the state. I maintained the rules meticulously, adding new ones as needed, and adjusting others to adapt to modern circumstances. Jackson, who had become my closest friend, occasionally expressed concern about my increasing isolation. "You're becoming like your uncle," he said during one visit, "all wrapped up in this place, hardly ever leaving." "The farm needs constant attention," I replied, not mentioning that leaving for more than a day weakened my connection to the entity, making the covenant harder to maintain. "It's not healthy," he insisted. "Everyone needs balance." Perhaps he was right. The changes in me had accelerated. My hair now contained strands of green among the brown. My eyes reflected light like a nocturnal animal's, and small plants sometimes sprouted where I stood too long. I dreamed in languages I'd never learned and could predict weather patterns with perfect accuracy. On my monthly vigils, the entity showed me more of its nature, its emergence from the primordial energies that formed the continent, its long dormancy broken by cycles of partial awakening, its simultaneous existence in dimensions adjacent to our own. I understood now that what we perceived as a single consciousness was actually a vast collective, aspects of itself extending throughout the land, like mycorrhizal networks connecting separate plants. And it was changing me, gradually incorporating my awareness into its own. The prospect should have terrified me, but instead I found it strangely comforting. The idea of my consciousness continuing as part of something ancient and enduring. Was this how all walkers ended, becoming one with what lived below? The answer came from an unexpected source. During a particularly intense vigil, when the boundary between my mind and the entities seemed especially thin, I encountered another awareness within its collective, a familiar presence that I eventually recognized as my great-uncle Elijah. "You've done well," his consciousness communicated. "Better than I did. I fought it too long, tried to break free." "What happened to you?" I asked without words. I became part of it, as all walkers eventually do, but I preserved enough of myself to watch, to wait for you. His presence conveyed complex emotions, regret mixed with acceptance, loneliness with belonging. The transformation can be gentle or violent, depending on how you approach it. I chose the harder path. And now I am both Elijah and more than Elijah, as you will be both yourself and more than yourself when the time comes. This revelation brought both clarity and new questions. If this was the inevitable fate of those who maintained the covenant, was I merely postponing the inevitable? Or was there value in maintaining the balance for as long as possible, protecting those around me from what would emerge if the covenant failed. That autumn, 3 years after I first set foot on the Walker farm, I made my decision. I would continue as guardian and caretaker, maintaining the covenant while preparing for my eventual transformation, but I would do so with full awareness and on my own terms. I began preparing the farm for its future. I established a land trust to ensure the property remained undeveloped, regardless of who inhabited it. I documented all the rules in a new journal, free from the cryptic language of the old one, explaining each ritual and its purpose clearly. I created maps showing the boundaries of the entity's influence and safe zones where its effects were minimized. Most importantly, I began identifying potential successors, individuals who might have the capacity to take on the responsibility if something happened to me before my transformation was complete. Daniel and Maya's daughter Lily showed the most natural affinity, but she was too young. Jackson's nephew Aaron had the right temperament and sensitivity to the land. And there was a graduate student, Sophia, who had come to study local agricultural practices but had shown unusual awareness of the farm's nature. The entity observed these preparations with what I interpreted as approval. During our communions, it shared more freely, showing me methods to strengthen the boundaries between worlds while maintaining the necessary connections. Together, we refined the covenant, making it more resilient and adaptable to changing conditions above and below. One night, as winter approached again, I sat on my porch watching the black birds arrange themselves in familiar patterns along my fence. The air carried the first hint of frost, and the crops had been harvested for the season. In the distance, lights shone from Daniel and Maya's farmhouse, where I knew Lily was probably dreaming of talking plants and friendly shadows. I added a final entry to my journal. The land and I are becoming one, not through surrender, but through mutual transformation. What began as a burden has become a calling. I am the walker, the caretaker, the boundary keeper, and when I am gone, another will come, as it has always been. Outside my window, the crops swayed in perfect rhythm, despite the absence of wind. Beneath the rich soil, something ancient listened, waited, and dreamed of the surface world. And I, the latest in the line of walker caretakers, dreamed along with it, of roots deep in darkness and branches stretching toward the light, of bargains made and kept, and of the thin boundary between blessing and curse that my ancestors had walked for generations. The land was mine now, in all its beautiful, terrible fertility, and I was its.